There is one commodity above all others upon which Russia has relied to keep its Ukraine invasion going: oil. And we're not just talking about the oil products, such as fuel, that Russia sends to its soldiers on the front lines. Oil has been Russia's economic lifeline at a time when much of the world is refusing to buy much of anything else from it. The West has tried to limit Russia's oil sales, but Vladimir Putin has always found a way around sanctions and other measures. Now, one country has had enough. Australia just struck Russia hard, and you won't believe how. On September 18th, United 24 Media reported that Australia has just approved a pair of new measures that it hopes will kneecap Russia's ability to make money from its vast amounts of crude oil. In a double-barrel blow to Putin, Australia says that it's going to implement a steep new price cap on Russian oil, along with implementing sanctions against an entire navy's worth of the shadow fleet vessels Putin has been using to illicitly transport his country's oil all around the world. Let's start with the price cap. A price cap, which Australia observed, was already in place on Russia's oil. The big difference this time around is that the cap that previously sat at $60 per barrel of oil is now going to be lowered to $47.60 per barrel. That $12.40 reduction may seem like a fairly small amount when taken in isolation, but the sheer scale of Russia's oil sales means that this single move has the potential to cost Putin billions of dollars that he's using to fund his war machine. Some quick maths shows us just how much of an impact this new price cap has the potential of having. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, said in August that Russia sold 7.3 million barrels of oil per day in July. At the previous price cap of $60 per barrel, that amounts to $438 million in daily oil sales. With the new price cap in place, that amount drops to $347.48 million per day. So Russia is going to be losing an eye-watering $90.52 million daily, assuming the price cap is recognized and implemented internationally. The numbers make for even worse reading for Putin when you blow them up for an entire year. 7.3 million barrels of oil sold per day amounts to 2.6645 billion barrels annually. At the $60 price cap, that would mean Russia generates about $159.8 billion from its oil sales annually. Of course, there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. First, not all of that money goes to the Russian state. Instead, Russia taxes these sales, earning a percentage of revenue in the process. Second, this figure assumes that every nation is sticking to the price cap that is already in place. That's not the case. The likes of China and India, which have been buying Russian oil via the shadow fleet that we'll cover in a moment, may be paying slightly more. It won't be much more. Both countries know they have leverage over Russia, meaning they can negotiate low prices of their own for the oil they buy due to Putin having nowhere else to go. Still, this means that the $159.8 billion figure is an approximation. But it's one that serves the purpose of showing just how much money Russia is about to lose thanks to Australia. Now that the price cap has been dropped to $47.60, Russia will be earning a little over $126.8 billion from its oil annually. That's around $33 billion disappearing down the drain, at a time when Russia is believed by some to be spending as much as $1 billion per day on the war in Ukraine. Make no mistake about it, Australia just hit Russia hard with this price cap. We say Australia, the land down under isn't the only country that's going to implement this new price cap, as it's a cooperative effort between it and several other nations. That was revealed by Australia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Penny Wong, on the official ministry website. In a statement, Wong said, "Australia has taken this action alongside our international partners, including the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, and Japan. Australia maintains its total ban on imports from Russian oil and refined petroleum." We'll come back to that total ban in a moment. What we have here is Australia teaming up with 4 other countries to implement a price cap that delivers a powerful gut punch to Vladimir Putin. Foreign Minister Penny Wong included the EU in her list, but it's worth noting that the EU had already acted back in July, setting its own price cap at $47.60 per barrel of Russian oil, meaning Australia and the other countries Wong mentions are just piling on the pressure. The EU made the first move, Australia and 4 other countries followed. That's almost the entire West teaming up to hurt Putin. Right now, the US is missing from that list. S&P Global said in June the US is unlikely to lower its own price cap from $60 where it currently stands. But the option is there. And now that so many other Western countries are doing it, US President Donald Trump may decide he has an opportunity to twist the knife in Putin's side by following the lead of American allies. There is a small caveat to all of this, and it comes in the form of something that Wong mentions in her statement. Australia's Minister of Foreign Affairs is right to say that the country has an outright ban on buying all Russian oil products, ranging from crude oil to refined oil such as gasoline. However, that ban isn't as effective as it could be. In July, the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, or CREA, revealed that Australia is still making use of Russian oil, albeit potentially unintentionally. CREA said that since the G7 placed its initial price cap on Russia's oil in February 2023 up until the end of June 2025, Australia spent $6.4 billion on oil products made by 3 refineries in India. The kicker is that all 3 of those refineries use Russian crude oil to make the products Australia bought. Not all of the $6.4 billion is linked to Russian oil. Korea estimates that about $2.5 billion of the products Australia bought were refined from Russian crude. Still, a worrying number here is that Australia thus far has sent $1.09 billion to Ukraine, meaning it's technically spending more on Russian oil by proxy than it has provided to Ukraine in military and humanitarian aid. We don't point this out to claim Australia as being disingenuous with its oil ban or its new decision to cap Russian oil even further. The point we're making here is that figuring out where the oil products a nation buys actually come from is a minefield of Russian misdirection. Even when measures are in place to stop Russia from selling its oil to other countries, it's finding ways to get around those measures. That makes it incredibly difficult for countries like Australia to follow through on their bans because the oil they buy from other countries is so often tainted by Russia's crude. But this is where the second part of Australia's two-punch combo against Russian oil comes into play. In addition to implementing a new price cap that could cost Russia billions of dollars with its direct sales of oil, Australia has also announced that it's going to sanction a huge swathe of the shadow fleet that Russia is using to send its oil to countries like India. We'll explore the shadow fleet in more depth later in the video, but for now it's enough to know that the fleet is hundreds of vessels strong, all of which use deceptive practices to hide from international monitoring agencies. Those practices include sailing under the flags of countries other than Russia, and even using GPS spoofing to throw the authorities off a ship's scent. It's thanks to these types of vessels that countries like Australia still end up buying Russian oil, albeit indirectly. Now Australia is taking aim at the shadow fleet. Australia will also impose targeted sanctions on a further 95 Russian shadow fleet vessels, Wong announced in her statement. With these additional listings, the Albanese government has now sanctioned more than 150 shadow fleet vessels since doing so for the first time in June 2025. In other words, Australia has more than doubled the number of shadow fleet vessels against which it has sanctions. Sanctions may seem like an off measure to take against the shadow fleet. After all, the very nature of this fleet means that official measures that might work against ships that sail legitimately don't work against shadow fleet vessels. However, that doesn't mean that sanctions have no impact. In a shadow fleet ship's case, sanctions can include forcing insurers to add clauses to their contracts that ban the insured ship from switching off its automatic identification system or AIS transponder. This AIS transponder is responsible for essentially telling the international shipping community the ship's identity, position, course, and speed. Along with that data, you can find additional information about who owns the ship and what it's carrying. Naturally, many shadow fleet vessels switch AIS transponders off. This isn't a perfect solution, of course, however it does force Russia into making tough choices with all of its shadow fleet ships. Remember, Russia does go to some lengths to at least make these ships appear legitimate when placed under light scrutiny. That's what flying under other nations' flags and registering those ships in other countries is all about. Insurance is a part of that feigned legitimacy, and it's naturally something that Russia will want for shadow fleet vessels. Sanctions like those we've just described mean that Russia's shady ships can't use one of their methods of evading authorities, which could result in seizures and lost profits. As we said, it's an imperfect measure, but having sanctions in place against 95 ships at least makes it less convenient for Russia to use those ships in the future. Ideally, it might even force Russia to withdraw some of the sanctioned ships from the waters because it doesn't want to take the risk of them being caught. Not only does that mean less oil being shipped, but it also means that Russia has then wasted money it spent to buy those ships in the first place. Throw the new price cap into the mix, and you see the whole point of what Australia has just done to make Russia hurt financially. And there's more. A couple of weeks before Australia announced its double-barreled gut punch to Putin, it also sanctioned 4 Russian individuals due to human rights abuses that they've committed during the Ukraine war. United 24 media reported on these new sanctions, noting that those whom Australia targeted have been complicit in suppressing political freedoms in Russia by cracking down on people who express support for Ukraine in its battle against Putin. As with the latest sanctions, Wong published a statement on the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs website to announce the sanctions. The Australian government is imposing further targeted financial sanctions and travel bans against 14 individuals responsible for silencing political expression in Russia, as well as enabling the illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine, Wong said. The human rights situation in Russia continues to deteriorate, with violent crackdowns aimed at suppressing human rights and anti-war advocacy. That announcement was delivered alongside another condemnation of Russia's actions in Ukraine, as well as Wong emphasizing that Australia already has a hefty package of sanctions implemented against Russia. That package is now 1,600 sanctions strong, with each of these sanctions being designed to weaken Russia's ability to finance the war that it started with Ukraine. In the case of individual sanctions, travel bans confine sanctioned people to Russia and a few other unsanctioned countries, often preventing them from making or soliciting foreign investments they can use to benefit themselves or their countries. It's a case of every little bit helping to hurt Russia. And Australia has more than 1,600 little ways of helping that add up to a lot of financial damage. Ukraine is certainly happy about Australia's price cap and shadow fleet sanctions. In a post on X, Andriy Sybiha, who is Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, said, "Grateful to the Australian government and my colleague at Senator Wong for their decisive support for Ukraine and for upholding international law. By lowering the Russian oil price cap and imposing targeted sanctions on 95 shadow fleet vessels, Australia is helping to restrict Russia's ability to fund its war and undermine global peace." That statement, particularly the part about restricting Russia's ability to fund the Ukraine invasion, brings us to how much of an impact this is really going to have on Russia. We've covered some of the key points already, particularly when it comes to how much money the new price cap could end up costing Russia and how sanctions can be implemented on shadow fleet vessels that exist to skirt sanctions. Meza adds that Australia doing all of this in conjunction with other nations is important when it comes to deterring Russian aggression as a response to Australia's new sanctions. Think of it as the same collective defense policy that underpins NATO. If Australia were just one nation alone attempting to stand up to Russia on the oil front, Putin could order a campaign of intimidation designed to make Australia back down. But it's not just Australia. It's Australia, 4 other nations, and the entire EU. It's a lot harder for Russia to intimidate such a united front, with that front also sending the message that a large portion of the international community still condemns Putin for his actions. Don't underestimate the impact of joint action on the lobbying front either. Multiple countries working in tandem can put pressure on international shipping bodies to enforce international law and, potentially, to cause more problems for Russia. It's all about coordination, which is why it's so smart that Australia isn't trying to pull off all of this alone. Next, let's hone back in on the price cap. The figures we shared earlier in the video are indicative of what the new price cap could achieve in a perfect world. Of course, we don't live in a perfect world. The price cap isn't global, as it's only those nations that implement it that are guaranteed to abide by it. Plus, as is the case with Australia, a price cap doesn't seem to mean much when the nation that implements it isn't buying Russian oil in the first place. However, it's the side effects of having that price cap in place that are more likely to damage Russia. The authors of a Harvard Kennedy School policy brief titled "The Price Cap on Russian Oil Exports Explained" offers an isolated example. The world is just beginning to understand the price cap's impact on Russian oil revenues, geopolitical alignments, and oil trade, the brief says. For example, in the months before it was implemented, reports suggested that the prospect of the price cap likely led Russia to offer crude oil at a cut rate to importers in Indonesia. This was written before the original $60 price cap was put in place by several Western nations. And the point being made is that price cap creates pressure. Russia knew that it was going to end up being forced to charge less for its oil, and it knew that the new measure gave other nations leverage. Indonesia benefited from being able to buy cut-price oil as Russia looked to unload it as quickly as possible as a result. Even before the cap was in place, Russia was forced to charge less than it otherwise would. Now that cap is $47.60, Russia has to charge even less. It's like we said before, any country that buys Russian oil knows that it can take advantage of Putin's desperation to sell by offering far less than the going price for a barrel. Transfer pricing will still be an issue. This is when Russia declares a certain price that it's charging for its oil, though it ends up charging a higher price when that oil arrives at its destination. Chatham House has highlighted this issue and noted that it's something made possible by Russia's shadow fleet. It proposes closing the Baltic Strait to vessels that are potentially dangerous or improperly insured, which describes the shadow fleet to a T. Given that about 60% of Russia's oil and petroleum products exports have to pass through the Baltic Straits to reach their markets, the closure of navigation to shadow fleet vessels should enable enforcement of the cap to start become self-sustaining, although it may not necessarily eliminate transfer pricing, Chatham House says. Elimination doesn't have to be the goal if more of these ships end up being prevented from exiting the sea they need to exit to transport their wares. Speaking of the shadow fleet, anything Australia can do to limit the fleet's effectiveness is good for Ukraine. We discussed earlier how sanctions that lead to insurers requiring Russia's shady vessels to meet certain requirements could force Putin into taking those vessels off the seas. In terms of monetary impact, Russia has spent $14 billion to build a shadow fleet that numbers anywhere between 300 and 600 ships, depending on whose estimates you listen to. Australia has sanctioned 95 of those ships with its latest measures. Russia isn't going to stop using all of those ships, of course, but even if Australia only manages to pressure Putin into stopping the use of a handful, that's still hundreds of millions of Russian dollars wasted on vessels that end up rotting away in Russian ports. But in the end, there's likely to be one major winner from the new price cap and sanctions. It won't be Ukraine either, though the country always benefits from measures that hurt Russia financially. No, the big winner in all of this may end up being a supposed Russian ally that is more than happy to take advantage of Russia's oil becoming even cheaper: China. Al Jazeera reports that China is the world's largest buyer of Russian oil, having purchased 109 million tons in 2024, which accounted for 20% of Beijing's total energy imports. There's a reason that China has been buying so much Russian oil, and it's not because the country is trying to support Russia. That happens indirectly. However, the reason China buys so much is because, as we touched on earlier, it has Russia over a barrel, literally. China is making hay while the sun shines by purchasing as much of Russia's oil as it can now that price caps have pulled the amount it has to pay way down. Now that an even lower price cap is in play, China can tell Russia that it wants a discount too. Russia won't be able to say no. China is its biggest oil customer. Here we see China's opportunism in action, and it's enriching itself at the cost of Russia, all thanks to Western sanctions and price caps. China looks set to save a lot of money thanks to Australia. Russia Matters says that Beijing has already spent $16 billion less on Russian oil between March 2022 and June 2024 than it would have if the West weren't hitting Russia's oil industry so hard. That's a big chunk of change that is only going to get bigger as countries like Australia make it even harder for Russia to sell its most valuable commodity. Furthermore, the $16 billion figure only accounts for sales that were officially registered. Whatever Russia has sold to China via its shadow fleet will also be discontinued, so the real number may be billions of dollars higher. In an ideal world, Australia and other Western countries would be looking for a way to stop China from benefiting from Russia's pain. But even if that doesn't happen, the outcome is the same. Australia and its allies will cost Russia billions of dollars with their new price caps and sanctions. And as more sanctions hit Russian oil, Ukraine is taking the fight to Russia's most valuable industry directly. St. Petersburg burns as Russia fails to stop Ukraine's massive strike. Find out more in our video.